I have been at St. James serving as the pastor for now, I'm in my 26th year. In my 20th year, which was 6 years ago, I gave my then district superintendent, Ken Jackson, a heart attack. Once a year in January, back in those days it was once a year. Now with Jeff it's twice a year. But once a year you go and meet with your district superintendent and you talk about whether you think you're going to be staying, you think you should stay, what do you think the congregation's going to say about whether you should stay or not, and all the good kind of stuff. So after staying for 20 years, when you go in and sit down with your district superintendent, Ken walked over. You know, he left all of his paperwork, he left his notebook on his desk, and he came around the corner and he said, "So I suppose, James, you're going to be staying for another year." And I said, "Ken, I think I've heard God say to me, it's time for me to go." So after Ken recovered, I don't know, he fell on the floor, you know, dusted himself off. He didn't fall on the floor and he didn't have to dust himself off, but he had a completely shocked look. It changed the whole tenor of the conversation. He goes back behind his desk and he gets a notepad and he comes back around and he says, "I know how to do this with normal people, but I'm not sure how to do this with you." Thanks, Ken. But after 20 years, I thought I was hearing the voice that it was time for me to move on from St. James, that I had done what I could do, and that it was time to move on. And so I entered the process. I signed all the right documents. The staff parish said, "We think you should stay, but whatever, and I put myself in the hands of the cabinet and the bishops. And of course, on the last day, the very last day that the cabinet meets, which was 3 months later, I'm preparing to move. I'm doing all the things, making sure everything is straight, unbroken, ready to go. The database is up to date as before it crashed and the computer died and the backups were gone and, all of that kind of, I put all that stuff together. And on the last day of the cabinet meeting, Ken, my district superintendent, calls me in the morning and says, "James, we can't find a place to send you, so you're going back." Then, later that morning, at 11 o'clock, Youngjin Cho, who was the district superintendent of the next district over, and later bishop of the Virginia Annual Conference, calls me and says, "James, the cabinet and we met, and we discerned that you should go back to St. James." So I got it twice. Once from Ken, who said, "We can't find a place to send you," and then once, "We discerned that you should go back." Now, whichever it was, we couldn't find a place to send you, or we discerned you should go back, doesn't matter anymore. What I thought I was hearing in the way of God's voice was apparently not what the cabinet heard. And the voice sounds different, I think, for each one of us. And the voice that we hear from God sometimes is shaped or sounds or pulls us in unique directions. I want to read you a story. We've started this series because over the years, so many people have come to talk to me about how their call doesn't fit the A-list calls. And I don't know what an A-lister is in the Bible, because if you made it into the Bible, that's an A-list to me, as far as I'm concerned. But if you didn't make it, but if you're not Moses with a burning bush that's speaking to you but not burning up, and if you're not Paul with a bright light on the road to Damascus, shooting right into your eyes so that you're blind for 3 days, then apparently or we could list a whole bunch of other people with big old calls. If you're not one of those people, then apparently you're not called. That's what people come and talk to me about. "James, why? I'm not feeling called. I'm waiting for the clouds to roll back and for this loud, imagined masculine voice. I don't know what God's voice sounds like. It could sound like anything. Sometimes it sounds like nothing, silence, according to Elijah. But we're waiting for that big voice. And maybe the problem is that we've been expecting the wrong thing for way too long. If you keep waiting for a red car to drive by, stand out on the curb and wait for a red car you're expecting, and the person who's coming for you is in a blue car, you will never see the red car arrive because it's a blue car, not a red car. And maybe our challenge is the same challenge that a young man named Samuel had. This is from 1 Samuel. Yeah, he got a book named after him. All right, so there we go. Yeah, he got not just one. This is 1 Samuel. Then there's 2 Samuel. He got 2 books. 2 books, man. 2 books. In any case, Samuel's call. This is his story. Okay, let me give you a little background. Just a little tiny bit of background. Samuel's mom's name is Hannah, and she didn't have any children. And she wanted children. So she went to Shiloh, which is where the Ark of the Covenant was, and where Eli and his sons presided over worship and connection with God there. And she prayed that God would give her a child, and God answered. And so she named him Samuel. And Samuel means God hears or God has heard. So his name means, God heard me, I'll name him. But not only did she want a son so badly, she felt like since God had given her a son, she was going to dedicate her son to the Lord. So she took him, Hannah took Samuel to the temple and said to Eli, God has given me this gift, this son, and I'm dedicating him to the Lord. And Samuel stayed at the temple and kind of became, in a priest in training, if you will. So priests in training apparently sleep in the same room that the Ark of the Covenant hangs out in. Just so you know, I have never slept in the room where the Ark of the Covenant hangs out, if you were wondering. It didn't happen with me. So that is where Samuel is now. He was, it's about bedtime. Now the boy Samuel was serving the Lord under Eli. The Lord's word was rare at that time, and visions weren't widely known. One day, Eli, whose eyes had grown so weak he was unable to see, was lying down in his room. God's lamp hadn't gone out yet, and Samuel was lying down in the Lord's temple where God's ark is. The Lord called to Samuel. "I'm here," he said. Samuel hurried to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me?" And "I didn't call you," Eli replied. "Go lie down." And so Samuel did. Again, the Lord called Samuel. So Samuel got up, went to Eli, and said, "I'm here. You called me?" Eli said, "I didn't call, my son. Go lie down." Now, this is a parenthetical phrase. Now, Samuel didn't yet know the Lord, and the Lord's word hadn't been revealed to him. A third time, the Lord called Samuel. Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "I'm here. You called me?" Then Eli realized something was going on. Eli realized it was the Lord who was calling the boy. So Eli said to Samuel, "Go and lie down. If he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down where he had been. Then the Lord came and stood there, calling just as before, "Samuel, Samuel?" Samuel said, "Speak, your servant is listening." As I read this story and as I thought about, you may think Samuel's an A-lister. Okay, I didn't really, he's an A-lister, James. He's got a book named after him. Whatever. He did not even recognize the call when it came. He did not recognize the voice of God when it came to him. He didn't recognize where it was coming from, what was going on. He was sure it was Eli. And Eli wasn't sure where it was coming from. It took 4 times. 4 times for Eli to figure out, oh, wait a second. Maybe that's God. And if it is, you need to be ready for whatever God says to you. Speak, your servant is listening. So what do we kind of glean from this story about calling? First of all, it wasn't an audible voice to anybody but Samuel. Only Samuel heard God's call. Maybe Eli would have recognized it was God if he had heard it too. But only Samuel heard it. It was specifically targeted at Samuel. Samuel, Samuel. Called him by name. Maybe that's the first thing we should recognize about this story. God already knows your name. God already knows who you are. God already knows what you're wired to do, who you're meant to be, what the meaning of your life might be if you lived fully into the call to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, and whatever specific call that might rest on you. God already knows your name. I've heard it said, God's got your number. And I'm not talking about your cell phone, although it could work with that whole cell phone thing. You know, the image, God is calling. God has got your number. God knows Samuel. God already has a purpose and a hope and a dream for this Samuel. And God speaks to him in a way that he heard. It was loud enough, apparently, he heard a voice and he responded. Now, as it turns out, he responded to the wrong guy. He thought it was Eli. Now, admittedly, the name Eli means, my God. So he responds, runs into the other room, and Eli's like, no, it's not me. I didn't call you. You're hearing things, Come one more time. We're going to call the guys in white suits, take you down to the local store because you're hearing voices. Only in this particular case, it was God's voice. It was God's voice, and it just took a little while to recognize. Now, the second thing that I notice about this, I notice this third, but I'm going to say it second because then we'll deal with the third piece second and the second piece third. The second thing I noticed is sometimes in order to hear God's voice, you need somebody to help you. Even if it's somebody who has fallen out of favor with God. You didn't read this. We didn't read this whole story here, but Eli has already gotten word that his whole family is out of favor with God now. Eli, the current priest, found out, your sons are like doing really bad stuff. Selling favors, and we won't go into all the details of what the sons are doing, but they're acting inappropriately for priests. And so it's going to all be over. And yet Eli is the one that helps Samuel recognize God's call. You don't know who's going to help you recognize God's call. I'd like to say there's a specific mentor dude, kind of like a midwife that you go to. You know what the midwife's going to do? Help you give birth. I'd like to tell you that there is one, come see me. Make an appointment, come see me, and after 15 minutes I'll tell you exactly what God's calling you to do. I'd like to tell you that that's how it works. And maybe sometimes it does. Sometimes you come sit and talk to me, and I've had people come and sit and talk with me, talk through what they think they're hearing, their call, and walk away feeling, like they had a sense of what God was calling them to do. Was it me? No, it was somehow God in the mix, and I don't know how that all works all the time. But oftentimes it's a surprising person, and it may not even be a Christian person. It may not even be a person from your faith community that may say to you, have you ever thought about X? And that person can give you a clue. Eli may have once been a good priest, but he is no longer. And yet God uses him. God uses him to help Samuel recognize. So please don't discount somebody who says to you, you know what I notice about you? You are so X, whatever X is. Or you are so Y. You are so loving. You are so focused. You are so insightful. You are so wise. You are so organized. Make the list. Someone says that to you. It doesn't have to be a person from St. James for it to be true. If something is true, it's always true. It's not just true if a Christian tells you, but it's not true if an atheist tells you. If the sun's up and, an atheist says to you that the sun's up, you say, no, that's an atheist. That guy doesn't know. And then some Christian walks up to you and says, the sun's up. Oh, yeah, that's true. You know why it's true? Because a Christian told me. The truth is the truth. And sometimes the truth is known by not just people of faith. And sometimes people of faith don't seem to know the truth at all. So you can be surprised. Just be prepared to be surprised by who God might use in your life to be a midwife for you. Yes, we used the midwife issue last week because Shifra and Pua. But I think that all of us, if you'll walk with me on this, all of us are spiritually pregnant people. We are spiritually present, waiting to give birth to what God wants to do in our lives. And as spiritually pregnant people, sometimes we need a good midwife. Or maybe even a bad midwife, just somebody to show up and help us give birth to that thing God wants to do in our lives. Now, sometimes it's somebody who's official, who wears St. James shirts and, seems to know what they're talking about. But I suspect that for most of us, it's not. It's not the district superintendent telling you, we don't have a place to send you, or we discerned you needed to go back. Sometimes you kind of started to know it yourself prior to that time, but didn't trust yourself. And by the way, you were already in the process, so there was no backing out until they call you and tell you, guess what? We decided you couldn't go anywhere. You're staying there. And of course, I stayed. We sold a building. We moved to temporary space. And then we moved right back on the west end, 500 feet from where we were all along. Because apparently God is just funny like that. God is just funny like that. So we need someone to help us recognize, and that person is not always the person we expect or imagine. And it sometimes is somebody who's not even a person of faith, who just recognizes something in you because, guess what? Their image of God that's inside of them that they haven't fully come to recognize sees something in your image of God and reveals it to you. Now, there was a third point, and I just can't remember what it is now. It's something really good. Let's see. We got the mentor piece, which was really the third point. The second piece was God doesn't give up. God doesn't give up. God didn't call Samuel once and say, Samuel! And Samuel gets up and Eli says, go to bed, wasn't me. And God stopped because, you missed it. Ooh, sorry. One chance, and it's over. God keeps calling. God doesn't give up. If he were on Galaxy Quest, never give up, never surrender. That's what God would say. Never give up, never surrender. I'm going to keep coming after you. I'm going to keep inviting you. I'm going to keep calling you. I've told you before, I felt my first sense of call when I was 14 years old, preaching a sermon on Scout Sunday. I ignored it. I completely ignored it. So God came after me again. I was 19 years old. I was sailing on a ship in the middle of the Persian Gulf. And God spoke to my heart. And there happened to be a chaplain come aboard our destroyer the next day. They ferried him over. They move from ship to ship when you're in the middle of the ocean. Catholic priest. And I got a chance to talk to him, and I talked about what I was thinking, and he said, I know you're a Protestant, so I don't know, but it sounds a lot like call to me. He's a Catholic. I'll discount him. How often can we be surprised by who we discount in life? A Catholic priest. You can either thank or be sad about me being your pastor because of that Catholic priest who said, I think that could be a call. And, however many years later, here I am. God is unrelenting in the sense that God really would like for you to be fulfilled. You see, we think of God as unrelenting in a mean kind of way. We think of unrelenting as like wearing you down. But I think God is unrelenting because God loves you so much and knows you will never feel fulfilled as long as you're doing less than what you could be doing if you said yes. If you said yes, here I am. Speak. Your servant is listening. If you just said that, God says, you know, it's not that what you're doing is pointless. It's just not for you. You could be more fulfilled if you loved a few more people or if you did X, and I don't know what the X is. Keep coming back to X. I don't know. Marks the spot. God is calling. So, I believe, and I believe the biblical witness is, that all of you are called. You read this book carefully from beginning to end, you will find that there are no uncalled people in the world. So all of you are called. If that's the case and God is calling to you, I have some questions and assignments for you. You know, that's the way I work. At least I do now. One of the assignments I want you to ask yourself this week, how am I expecting God's call to come? How am I expecting God's call to come? Is it one day I'm just going to open the Bible up and let's see. I opened it to Corinthians and it says, if I speak in the tongues of human beings and of angels, but I don't have, well, that's because I read that every day. That always drops open on that page now. You know, I'll open the book and it's going to tell me, am I expecting that that's the way God's going to speak to me? Am I expecting that I'm going to walk out my front door one day and where there was never a bush before, one's going to just pop up and be on fire, only not burning, and it's going to talk to me? And if that's what am I expecting that? Am I expecting the clouds to part and there will be an audible voice, hello, this is God? Oh, so nice to get to finally hear from you. Don't talk back to me while I'm talking to you. You know, I don't think God talks like that, by the way, or sounds at all like that. I don't know exactly what God will sound like for you. But ask yourself how you're expecting to hear from God. Maybe you're expecting that the only way you're going to hear about God is on a Sunday morning when I'm preaching. Or maybe you're only going to hear it when you're listening to Christian music on, WGTS. Or you're only going to hear God, and maybe one day you're going to, be listening to secular music and some song, a Daughtry song, Home, might speak to you about, I'm going home to the place where I belong. And that place for you is God, is church. And that God is waiting for you there. And that's the moment when you say, yes, I'm going home. And you realize that that message is for you. Ask yourself this week where you expect to hear God. And then I want you to pray that you'll just get rid of that expectation. That you will trust God to speak to you whatever way God chooses to. Maybe it's through the pastor of St. James, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's the homeless guy on the corner that you keep looking away from when but this day you decide to have an engaged conversation. Jesus did say, the least of these, my brothers and sisters, when you do it to them, you do it to me. Could it be surprise? Jesus on the corner? It might be. All I'm saying is sometimes we shut the door on God speaking to us because we have set up certain expectations about how God is going to do it, and God chooses another way. I have now come to believe, old man that I am at 55, that God can use anything, anywhere, anytime, and anyone to speak to me. Do you know, long before there was a book that we bind, in this case in leather, but long before there was a book that was bound, there was the spoken word. And before there was even the spoken word, do you believe there wasn't God? Well, there was. And the only Bible was creation. Because you see God revealed all the time. So maybe God speaks to you in nature. Maybe God speaks to you in the line at McDonald's. Maybe God speaks to you in the Bible, in this Bible, in the written Bible. Maybe it speaks to you in your spouse. Sometimes I found that the most profound voices that spoke to me for many years were the voices of tiny children in the back seat of my F-150, Hannah and Joshua, speaking the word of God to me. Words that I had spoken to them but not been serious about. You know, Dad, what you said to that other driver, that hurt God's feelings and that other person's feelings. You need to apologize, Dad. And by the way, it hurt my feelings too. I'm sorry, Hannah. I'm sorry, Hannah, I said that, and I'm sorry to God. Dad, you need to get out of the car and go tell. No, I am not telling the other driver, first of all, what I said about them, and second of all, asking for forgiveness. I could be shot on the street. We'll just have to trust God will cover this. You don't know where the word is coming from. But I will tell you, God, you should expect that the word will come. What you do about it is up to you. Find somebody to help you. Maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a spouse, maybe it's a random person on the street. They might look at you a little strange if you walk up and say, I'm trying to figure out my call. What do you think? I think I don't know you. Please don't talk to me anymore. God is calling. Are you willing to do whatever it takes to hear what God has to say? Can you say with the chorus of the song we just sang, or the full song we're going to be singing him later on, here I am, Lord. Is it I, Lord? I've heard you calling in the night. It's always interesting perspective on life. I'll just say this one thing. James said it's an old song. 1981 was when it was written. I graduated from high school in 1981. I now feel ancient. Very, very ancient. It's older than a lot of what we sing. It's not as old as Amazing Grace or How Great Thou Art or the Psalms, which, by the way, is the model for many of the songs we sing. So some of these songs that we sing in worship are even older than how, Here I Am, Lord. But I'm not taking issue with him. I heard him and I thought, I think this was written in 1981. And I happen to have a hymnal. I know a strange book, but it said, 1981, words and music, 1981. Oh my. I was a different man then. So I was much younger. I didn't look quite so old and squidgy around the edges.